In the busy streets of Lagos, life moved fast, but suddenly a young woman named Adana fell to the ground. People rushed toward her, shocked to see her lying helpless. A car stopped and strangers quickly lifted her into it, rushing her to the nearest hospital. Nurses hurried her into the emergency room, but after the first aid, the doctors stepped back. Their faces turned serious as they asked about her relatives, someone to sign papers and pay her bill. But no one came forward. Adana lay weak on the hospital bed, hearing the whispers around her. Some staff said she had no one, others pitied her, while a few shook their heads, convinced she would not survive if the bills were not settled. The air in the ward felt heavy with silence, broken only by machines beeping near her bed. She tried to speak, to explain that she had no family nearby, but her voice was faint, almost drowned out by the chatter of those who doubted she had anyone at all. The doctors, strict and firm, reminded the nurses that treatment could not continue unless payment was made. One nurse quietly covered her with a thin blanket, while another sighed, saying, "This girl is all alone." Adana closed her eyes, a single tear escaping, not only from the pain in her body but from the fear that she might truly be abandoned in her most desperate moment. Every minute that passed felt like a heavy stone pressing down on her chest. The lights above her flickered, and she wondered if this was how her story would end, not on a battlefield of life, but in a cold hospital room where no one claimed her. She listened to footsteps coming and going, to doctors asking again if any relative had arrived, and each time the answer was the same: none. In the corner of the ward, an old janitor paused while sweeping the floor. His eyes lingered on Adana, noticing the helpless way she stared at the ceiling. He could not look away. But for now, no one else cared, no one else stepped forward. She remained there, weak and forgotten, while the doctors repeated their warning: without payment, her treatment would stop. And in that crowded city of millions, Adana realized she had never felt more alone in her life. Adana's story began far from the noise of Lagos, in a quiet fishing village by the river. Her father died when she was still a little girl, leaving her mother, Ifeanyi, to raise her alone. Life in the village was harsh. Every day her mother went to the river, casting nets with trembling hands just to bring home a little fish to sell. Sometimes they ate, sometimes they went to bed hungry. Adana grew up watching her mother's strength, but also her tears in the dark when she thought no one was listening. Despite the struggles, Adana dreamed big. She wanted more than the endless cycle of poverty. When she turned 18, she left her village, promising her mother she would find work in the city and change their lives. With a small bag of clothes and her mother's blessings, she boarded a crowded bus to Lagos, her heart full of hope. The city, however, was not what she imagined. At first, she found work as a cleaner in a small restaurant, but her employer often delayed her pay. When she asked for her wages, he accused her of being ungrateful and sent her away. She stayed with a friend for a while, believing she had found a sister in her, but soon discovered the friend had been using her to cover rent and food. When Adana lost her job, the same friend told her to leave, saying she could not carry her burden anymore. One betrayal followed another. She tried selling fruits by the roadside, but market leaders demanded daily fees she could not afford. She worked as a nanny for a wealthy family, but when she fell sick one day, they replaced her without notice. Each time she thought she was building a new life, the ground was pulled from beneath her feet. She rarely heard from her relatives, and when she did, their voices carried only complaints or demands. No one asked about her struggles. The city that was supposed to lift her out of poverty instead swallowed her dreams piece by piece. Nights were the hardest, when she lay on a thin mat in a crowded room she rented with strangers, staring at the ceiling, wondering if her mother was still waiting for her to come back home. Now, lying on the hospital bed, she remembered all these moments. The faces of those who turned their backs, the promises that broke, the weight of endless rejection. Her body was weak, but her heart carried a heavier pain, the crushing truth that after everything, she was truly alone. Lying weak on the hospital bed, Adana reached for the small phone by her side. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the contacts. She told herself that someone, anyone, would answer her call. With what little strength she had, she dialed the first number, an old coworker from the restaurant. When the voice answered, she explained her situation, her voice breaking. But the reply was sharp and final: "I'm sorry, I can't help right now. I barely survived myself." The line went dead before she could say another word. Her chest tightened, but she refused to give up. She called another number, a friend she once trusted like a sister. The phone rang, and when it was picked, she begged for help. The voice on the other end grew uncomfortable. "Adana, I wish I could, but I have my own problems. Please understand." Then silence again. She wiped her tears and tried her cousin Ngozi, hoping family would not turn away. After a long pause, Ngozi sighed, "I can't take on your debt. Hospitals in Lagos are too expensive. Don't drag me into this." The rejection pierced deeper than her illness. Her breathing grew heavier, but she forced herself to keep calling. One by one, the numbers were dialed, and one by one, excuses came. Some said they had no money. Some didn't even answer. A few cut the call as soon as they heard her voice. Each response felt like another door slamming in her face, leaving her in complete darkness. As the night grew colder, Adana stared at the ceiling, the phone slipping from her hand. The beeping machines reminded her that time was running out, yet no one cared enough to come. She thought of her mother far away in the village, too poor to send even a fraction of what was needed. She thought of the people she once helped in small ways, who now turned away without hesitation. Every word of rejection echoed in her mind, louder than the hospital noises. "I can't help right now. I have my own problems. Don't involve me." The excuses blended into a cruel chorus that crushed the last bits of hope she clung to. Her eyes grew wet as she whispered to herself, "So this is how it ends." The pain in her body was sharp, but the pain of being abandoned by everyone she trusted was sharper. In that moment, she felt as though the whole world had decided she wasn't worth saving. Adana's last hope had been her cousin Ngozi. She had always believed that if everyone else turned away, family would still stand beside her. But when Ngozi answered the call, her voice carried no warmth. Adana begged, explaining the situation, but Ngozi's reply was cold. "I can't put myself in debt for you. The hospital will drag me down if I sign anything. Please don't call me again." The line ended, and Adana stared at the phone, her heart breaking into pieces. Even the person she thought was closest to her had abandoned her without hesitation. The ward was quiet, yet she could hear whispers from the nurses at the desk. Their voices were low, but every word reached her ears. "This girl has nobody. No one is coming for her. She will die here, just another forgotten patient." Another nurse sighed, shaking her head. "It's sad, but this is Lagos. If you don't have money or people, you're invisible." Their words cut into her like sharp blades. Adana turned her face to the wall, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She wanted to scream, but her voice was too weak. The city outside was alive with cars, laughter, and music, but inside this room, she felt like she no longer existed. She had never felt so small, so unseen, in a place filled with millions of people. The pain in her body was bad, but the pain in her heart was worse. Memories of her life flashed through her mind, her mother's sacrifices, her journey to the city, her endless struggles. She had fought so hard to survive, yet now, when she needed someone the most, not a single soul stood beside her. The loneliness wrapped around her like a heavy chain, pulling her deeper into despair. She listened again as the nurses passed by, whispering, "She won't make it through the night if no one pays. It's only a matter of time." Their words were not meant for her, but they echoed in her head until she believed them. She pressed her hands together weakly, whispering a prayer only God could hear. Her tears soaked the pillow as she realized she had been abandoned by blood, by friends, by everyone. And in that cold hospital room, surrounded by strangers and whispers, Adana felt invisible, just another forgotten life in a city that never stopped moving. The night grew heavy, and Adana lay on her bed with swollen eyes, her tears soaking the thin pillow beneath her head. The whispers of the nurses still echoed in her ears, each one reminding her that she had no one. She felt herself sinking deeper into despair, certain that the world had turned its back on her. Just then, footsteps approached softly, slower than the hurried steps of doctors or the tired strides of nurses. An old man, his uniform faded and broom resting on his shoulder, paused at her bedside. It was Chaik, the hospital janitor. He noticed the silent tears streaming down her face. For a moment he stood quietly, unsure if he should disturb her, but then he set his broom aside and gently poured some water into a cup. With trembling but kind hands, he offered it to her. "Here, my daughter," he said softly, "drink a little. It will ease your throat." His voice carried no judgment, no demands, only care. Adana looked at him through blurry eyes and, with weak hands, took the cup. The water felt like more than a drink, it felt like someone still saw her, someone still cared. Chaik pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. He asked no questions at first, just let her breathe. After a while, in a broken voice, Adana began to tell her story, about her poor childhood, her struggles in the city, the betrayal of friends, and how even her own cousin had refused to help. Every word spilled out with pain, and she feared he might grow tired of listening. But Chaik's eyes never left hers, and his silence spoke of patience and compassion. When she finished, she wiped her tears, ashamed that she had shared so much with a stranger. Yet Chaik shook his head and said quietly, "Life can be cruel, my daughter, but no one deserves to face it alone. You have suffered, but you are still here, still breathing. That means your story is not finished." His words, though simple, touched her more deeply than all the empty promises she had heard before. He could not take away her sickness or erase her pain, but in that moment, his presence gave her something far greater than medicine: hope. For the first time since she collapsed on the street, Adana felt she was not invisible. In the darkest corner of the hospital, an old janitor's kindness became the light that kept her heart alive. Morning light filtered into the hospital room, but Adana felt no relief. Her body was weak, her mind still heavy with fear. She expected another day of uncertainty, another day of waiting for death to come. Suddenly, the door opened and the hospital accountant entered with a file in hand. His expression was calm, almost routine, as he announced, "The bill for this patient has been settled. Treatment can continue." The word struck Adana like thunder. She raised her head slowly, not sure she had heard correctly. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice dry. The accountant repeated, "Your account has been cleared. You no longer owe anything." Her heart pounded in her chest. How could that be? She had no family willing to help, no friends to call on, no savings left. She stared at the ceiling, confusion flooding her mind. Had her cousin Gozi changed her mind? Did someone from the village come without her knowing? Nothing made sense. Tears welled in her eyes, this time not from despair but from disbelief. She struggled to sit up, her voice trembling. "Please, tell me, who paid for me?" The accountant simply closed the file and replied, "It is not my job to say. All I know is the bill is covered." He turned and walked out, leaving her shaking in confusion. Adana clutched the thin blanket to her chest, her thoughts racing. Every name she had called came back to her mind, but she remembered clearly how each one had rejected her. She thought of her mother, but knew she had nothing to give. The possibility of a stranger doing it seemed impossible. Why would anyone choose her, a woman alone with no one, to bear such a burden? Her tears rolled faster now, mixing fear with gratitude. She pressed her hands together, whispering, "God, who sent this angel? Who looked at me and decided I was worth saving?" Her voice cracked as she begged the nurses for answers, but they only shrugged, saying they knew nothing. That day, doctors returned to her bedside, speaking more gently as they prepared her treatment. Nurses moved with new energy, no longer whispering that she would die forgotten. Yet inside Adana's heart burned a new question that refused to rest: who paid for me? It became the only thought she carried, the mystery that now gave her a reason to keep breathing. Adana's mind refused to rest. Each passing hour, she asked anyone who entered her room the same desperate question: "Please, tell me who paid for me." The doctors only smiled faintly and avoided her eyes. The accountant had already walked away without explanation. The nurses busied themselves with charts and medicines, giving polite but empty answers. Her heart ached with curiosity. She could not imagine who would sacrifice so much for her when everyone she knew had already turned their backs. One evening, as the ward grew quiet and most visitors had gone home, a young nurse lingered by her bed. She adjusted Adana's drip slowly, her face thoughtful, as if carrying a secret too heavy to hold. Adana grabbed her hand weakly and whispered, "Please, I beg you. I cannot sleep without knowing. Who saved me?" The nurse looked around, lowered her voice, and finally said, "It was not family. It was not a friend. It was someone you would never expect." Adana's heart raced. The nurse hesitated before leaning closer and whispering, "It was Chaik, the janitor." For a moment, the words did not sink in. She blinked, confused. "Chaik, the old man who sweeps the floor?" The nurse nodded gently. "He went beyond what anyone imagined. He sold his old bicycle, the only one he had to move around, and borrowed money from neighbors in his compound just to cover your bill. He told us no one should die because they had no one." The truth hit her like a wave. Her chest tightened as tears spilled uncontrollably down her cheeks. She covered her face with both hands, shaking with sobs that came from deep inside. This man, who owed her nothing, who had nothing himself, had given away his little possessions to save her life. She remembered his soft words, the cup of water he had offered, the patience in his eyes as he listened to her story. She had thought it was just kindness to comfort her in pain, but now she saw it was far more. It was sacrifice. Her body trembled as she whispered through her tears, "Why would he do this for me? A stranger?" The nurse squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes, my dear, strangers carry the biggest hearts. He believed your life mattered." Adana cried until she could no longer speak, her tears soaking the pillow. She had been abandoned by blood, but saved by a man who swept hospital floors. And in that moment, she understood the meaning of true humanity. Days turned into weeks, and Adana's body began to respond to the treatment. The doctors were satisfied with her progress, saying the illness was no longer as threatening as before. Her strength returned little by little, but what surprised her most was that her heart felt lighter, not only because of medicine, but because of something much deeper. Each morning when she opened her eyes, she remembered that she was alive because someone who had nothing gave her everything. That thought became her true medicine. Chaik continued his work in the hospital as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Every time he passed her room, he smiled and greeted her warmly, but never once mentioned his sacrifice. He swept the floors, emptied bins, and carried out his duties with quiet humility. Adana would watch him sometimes from her bed, her eyes filling with gratitude. She wanted to call out, to thank him, but her throat tightened with emotion every time she tried. As her body healed, her spirit began to rebuild. She no longer felt invisible in the crowd of millions. She realized that the world still held people who cared, even when they had no obligation to. She thought about her family, her cousin, her so-called friends who had abandoned her, and strangely, the bitterness began to fade. They had left her, but God had sent her a stranger who acted like family. It was then she understood, family was not only blood. Family was anyone who stood with you when the world walked away. Every word Chaik had spoken that night when he first comforted her echoed in her heart. Life can be cruel, but no one deserves to face it alone. Those words now felt like a guiding light. Whenever sadness crept into her thoughts, she remembered that an old janitor had believed her life was worth saving. That belief gave her a strength she had never known. She began to smile again, not because all her problems were solved, but because her heart had found healing that medicine alone could not give. She promised herself silently that she would carry this lesson forever, that kindness can restore more than broken bodies, it can restore broken spirits. As she sat up one morning, watching the sunrise through the hospital window, Adana whispered to herself, "Family is not who shares your blood. It is who shows up when no one else does." And with that truth, she knew her life would never be the same again. When Adana finally regained her strength, the first thought that filled her mind was Chaik. She remembered the quiet janitor who had given everything he had to save her life, who had shown up when no one else cared. She could not imagine living without honoring his sacrifice. Determined, she promised herself that she would find a way to repay him, not just with words, but with action. With little money and no connections, Adana knew she had to start small. She rented a tiny space near a busy street and set up a humble food stall. Every morning before dawn, she prepared ingredients, cooked, and served customers with a smile, even when her hands ached and her feet were sore. The first weeks were tough. Sometimes she barely earned enough to buy supplies for the next day. But she refused to give up. Every meal she sold was a step toward rebuilding her life and a step toward fulfilling her promise to Chaik. Word of her food spread slowly. People appreciated her warmth and her cooking, and gradually, her small stall grew busier. She hired a neighbor's child to help clean up, giving back a little of the kindness she had received. Adana learned to budget carefully, save diligently, and reinvest in her growing business. With each passing month, her confidence grew, and her dreams became tangible. Through it all, she never forgot Chaik. Every decision, every success, reminded her of the man who had believed in her when the world had turned away. She visited him whenever she could, offering food, sharing stories of her progress, and making sure he knew how much she appreciated him. The joy on his face whenever she stopped by reminded her that gratitude, when acted upon, could be as powerful as the original act of kindness. Adana's life slowly transformed. She was no longer the weak, abandoned girl lying in a hospital bed. She was a young woman building her future from scratch, with determination, resilience, and a heart full of gratitude. Her past hardships had not defeated her, they had shaped her into someone who could value kindness, honor sacrifice, and repay love in meaningful ways. Every evening, as she counted her day's earnings and prepared for the next, she silently thanked Chaik again. Not just for saving her life, but for teaching her a lesson that would guide her forever. That true redemption comes not only from survival but from honoring those who saved you when no one else would. Adana's story was no longer about despair. It was about hope, action, and the unbreakable bond formed through selfless kindness. Years passed, and Adana's small food stall had grown into a thriving business. She had expanded into catering, opened a modest restaurant, and even started a small chain of food stalls across Lagos. Her determination, hard work, and the lessons she had learned in the hospital guided every decision she made. Despite her success, she never forgot the man who had saved her life when everyone else had abandoned her. Chike's kindness had left an imprint on her heart that time could never erase. One morning, Adana planned a surprise. She asked Chike to meet her at a location he did not recognize. When he arrived, he was greeted by a small crowd and a big sign in front of a newly built house. Adana stepped forward, her eyes shining with emotion. "Chike," she said, her voice trembling, "this is for you. A home of your own, safe and warm, for all the years you gave to others while asking for nothing in return." Chike's eyes widened in disbelief. He shook his head slowly, unable to find words. Adana smiled and continued, "And I've also arranged for your grandchildren to attend school without worry. You raised them with love, but now I want to help them succeed the way you helped me survive." Tears streamed down Chike's face as he finally spoke, his voice breaking. I didn't expect this. I only did what I could." Adana took his hands in hers, squeezing them tightly. "When I had nothing, you gave me everything. This is not repayment, it is honor." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Everyone around them felt the weight of that moment, the raw power of gratitude and the transformative effect of selfless kindness. Her story quickly spread across the neighborhood, and then online. People were inspired by the unlikely bond between a struggling young woman and an old janitor. Messages poured in, praising Chike's sacrifice and Adana's unwavering gratitude. Videos of the house, the celebration, and their embrace went viral, reaching thousands of hearts. It became a story repeated in homes, schools, and workplaces, a testament to the power of compassion. Adana reflected quietly that night. She realized that the greatest lessons in life often come from unexpected sources, and that true family is not always defined by blood but by love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Chike had shown her that one act of kindness, from the least expected person, could change a life forever. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of her labor and the man who had given her hope, Adana understood the truth she would carry for the rest of her life. Kindness has a ripple effect, and the smallest gesture at the right time can create a lifetime of gratitude, hope, and transformation.